The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The federal government has been in the student loan business for decades. Millions of students have run up tens of thousands of dollars in debt, which have made it difficult for them to borrow to buy houses or otherwise start their adult lives. A number of voices in the policy world have been advocating for Uncle Sam to forgive some or all of this debt. After President Biden took office in 2021, many political observers have thought that debt cancellation could have some chance of occurring. What questions does the cancellation of student debt raise? Would this be sound public policy? Would this do anything to control the cost of higher education? Joining me on EconVersations today is one of the leading economic voices on higher education, Dr. Andrew Gillen. Dr. Gillen is a senior policy analyst with the Texas Public Policy Foundation who is specialized in studying higher education. He recently authored a study for TPPF called The Problems with Student Loan Forgiveness. Dr. Gillen graduated from Ohio University and earned his PhD in economics from Florida State. He's worked for the Center for College Affordability and Productivity with Dr. Richard Vedder, with the American Institutes for Research, and the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Welcome to EconVersations, Andrew.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's get started here. And your paper actually talks about 18 different problems with student loan forgiveness. So we're not going to go through them one after another. But I do want to, I think before we get started here, mention that what we're talking about today is forgiving student loans. There is also the whole issue, we have a student loan program, and the arguments for having the government in the student loan business are different from what we're going to be focusing on today, and that's what's the cancellation or possible forgiveness of some of this debt. So before we get started, if you just say, do you think that there's a role for the government in the loan market to begin with before we get into talk about forgiving some of this debt?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a good argument for student loans to exist in some form, right? Because a lot of your typical high school graduates coming out of high school, they don't have a lot of income, they don't have a lot of assets, so they just don't have the ability to pay for expensive things like college. So there's a very big argument for student loans in some form to exist. So then the question is, okay, should the government be providing them? And historically in the U.S., we've said yes. I actually think that's a mistake. We have a well-developed financial system now. The financial system would be more than capable of providing student loans, and as kind of private private financial institutions could easily take over student loans. And the main reason that I think government involvement is a mistake is one of the things that we're talking about today, which is it can be used as a political football, where, hey, we've now got a president who's at least considered forgiving, $1.6 trillion in debt. And this is basically just pure politics from what I can tell. The other problem is that the government doesn't do a very good job pricing these things. And so there's a big debate over whether the government makes money or loses money on student loans. And that has changed a little bit over time. And one of the big issues there is that they basically use uniform pricing. So if you take a stellar student in a high demand field, so something like nursing, like you're a straight A student in nursing, there's no reason they should have the exact same interest rate in loan terms as like your slacker student who's majoring in some unemployable field and is probably not even going to graduate. Like those two students should be facing very, very different pricing incentives and structures, and the government just offers uniform terms, which I think is a real disservice, because prices are a very important signal and incentive And so when you just do something like uniform pricing, you really lose a lot of the informational value that's contained within prices.
Okay, so, but then today what we're going to be focusing on is the more narrow question. As you said, we've got about $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. People have taken out loans under this program, which it does exist, whether maybe it should be tweaked or in somewhat different form. It does exist. People have taken out these loans, and now we've got arguments being put forward that maybe these loans should be forgiven. And some of it could just be pure politics. It might get some votes. But beyond that, what are some of the arguments? Because you talk about some of these arguments in the paper. What are the sort of categories of arguments that people put forward as to why canceling or forgiving some of the loans could be good policy?
Yeah, so the most plausible arguments that I've seen, and in writing this paper, I tried to read as widely as I could to make sure that I uncovered all these arguments. But I basically found four buckets of kind of plausible arguments in favor of student loan forgiveness. So one was just kind of moral arguments. So these are the type of arguments like education is a right. We don't make you pay for rights, or a college degree is so much more necessary today, so people shouldn't have to pay for it. The second bucket is distributional. So this is just your classic transfer from people who have to people who don't. Third is quality of life. These are really hard to measure, but probably pretty important. So things like higher home ownership rates, higher marriage rates, which could have knock-on effects on the strength of communities and birth rates. And then last is kind of economic arguments that basically argue that forgiveness would basically stimulate the economy. So those are the four big buckets of arguments that I've seen that at least have sufficient plausibility to support loan forgiveness.
So let's begin then with some of these moral this category of moral arguments as to why perhaps some debts should be forgiven, and so. But I think there are, as you point out, there are a lot of really strong, in fact, even stronger moral arguments going back against this, as opposed to in favor of. So, if you can tell us some of the, I guess, moral arguments against forgiving these loans.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest one for me as an economist is that these loan forgiveness proposals are very, very regressive. So when we think about public policy, we generally think it's really bad when the government uses its power to transfer money, wealth, power, whatever, to the well-connected, the rich, the powerful. Like that the government, to the extent it's engaging in distributional activities at all, should be doing the opposite. It should be providing a safety net for those who've kind of fallen off the wagon. But student loan forgiveness, what it would do is it would basically send a lot of money to essentially really well or soon to be rich former student loan borrowers. So if you look at who has the most debt, it tends to be graduate students, because in graduate school you can basically borrow without limit, whereas at the undergraduate level we cap how much you can borrow. At the graduate level, there's no real cap, and so you can easily accumulate hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt if you're going to law school, medical school, stuff like that. And so when you look at who has the most debt, it tends to be dentists, doctors, lawyers. And so we're going to forgive, hundreds of thousands of dollars for these categories of people. But if you think about it, those tend to be very well compensated professions. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that we'd be using, taxpayer money from people who are making minimum wage to give dentists, doctors, and lawyers a huge windfall, it violates my sense of morality, and I don't think that's an appropriate use of government. The other big category of moral arguments against student loan forgiveness is that you're basically changing the rules midstream, right? So like you've got a whole bunch of people who either made decisions about what college they either went to in the past or they're going to now, based on what they could afford, what they were comfortable borrowing. and they worked at nights. Their parents worked double shifts. And so you've got all these decisions that were made, people sacrificing for sometimes decades so that their kids can go to college without having debt. And then all of a sudden, after the fact, you're going to say, oh, those other people who didn't sacrifice at all, we're going to make them just as well off as you, and you're going to pay for it then too, even though you paid for your kids already. There's just a huge amount of unfairness in changing those rules after the fact, to me.
Yeah, and I think that's, and if you want to think of it, if people were, if anything, responsible and didn't borrow more than they needed, or went to a relatively inexpensive in-state school, maybe we would start at a community college to keep their bills low. If they weren't spending excessively, if they weren't profligate in their spending, then in effect they're going to end up being punished. And so I mean, at some level, I think any policy that's going to punish those who are being responsible and reward those who are maybe less responsible is already unfair and not necessarily wise policy.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Now, you mentioned that much of the debt is much of the large amounts of student loan debt are held by people who have pursued graduate degrees. But even if you simply look at college, people who graduate from college, and this is well established in the income statistics, people who graduate from college end up doing much better on average economically than those who maybe only have a high school degree. So it's already the case that, I mean, if you want to think about who's benefiting, who's being taxed here, at some level, those who end up going to college and graduating are going to be not necessarily an economic elite, but certainly better off on average. I think I've seen an estimate that the college salary differential amounts to something like $1 million over a lifetime. And that gets back to the whole question of whether college should be free, because college isn't free. I'm a professor, so my salary has to be paid for. We need to have buildings and technology and so forth. So there costs real resources to run college. And so at one level, you can simply ask a question: who should be paying for these costs of college? College isn't free, even if you aren't going to charge somebody who goes to college for it. And I think one of the nice things about student loans is that even if you can't pay for it out of pocket when you go to school, you end up paying for it. You take out loans, and when you pay those loans back, the people who are benefiting are also, in effect, paying for this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the best kind of ways to think about this, I think, is that student loans are not about the price of college at all. All they are is about liquidity. So it's basically providing liquidity to students who basically don't have enough income or assets to afford college. When you talk about the price of college, then it's okay, who's going to pay? Is it going to be the student, families, parent, government, private philanthropy? That is where all the pricing conversation should take place. Is in that. The student loans really shouldn't be used as a way to try and influence the price of college, because they aren't appropriate to either raise money for the government or to subsidize college. Because remember, if we decide as a society that we want to subsidize college, and we do through things like Pell Grants and stuff like that. But student loans are not the way to do that, because only a small sliver of students actually take out student loans. So right now, I think around 39% of undergraduates take out student loans. So if we decide that we want the government to subsidize, you're only going to subsidize those 39%. So essentially, we really need to start thinking about student loans basically as just solving a liquidity problem. If we want to talk about a pricing problem, things like free college or what the breakdown should be between student responsibility, state responsibility, that's all about pricing, and that's a completely different issue in my book.
No, you used a term, and I want to expand on this a little bit for our viewers. And then you talk about this policy possibly being regressive, and you explained a little bit. But when we talk about regressivity, that's with regard to the income distribution. And I think there's been a number of different studies, not by like folks at the American Enterprise Institute and also like the Urban Institute, that really do document that when you look across the income distribution, it is people who are from families that are higher up in the income distribution have more student debt, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so this is exactly what you see in these studies that are looking at this, is that I cite one of these studies in the paper where they found the top 10% of the income distribution in the country would receive, I think, as much as the bottom 30% combined. Mm-hmm. So you take the 30% of poorest people in the country, they would basically be getting the same amount of benefit from loan forgiveness as the richest 10%, which is just insane, right? Like the richest 10% shouldn't be getting anything. They don't need it. They're already the richest 10%. And the fact that they'd actually be getting more and 3 times more on a per capita basis than the poorest 30% is just kind of crazy.
And another thing you mentioned is that some people make the point that some individuals are really being crushed by their student loan debt, but we have programs already in place that can deal with individuals who have a really large loan debt relative to their income. So tell us a little bit about these programs, because in some sense people are talking about a problem that's already been solved, and I think that's an important point.
This is what's so strange about this whole conversation to me, is that we've got this solution, and it's not 100% solution, but it's like a 93% solution that's already up and running, already exists, and people are just completely ignoring it and pretending like we've got a completely unaddressed problem. And so essentially, if you go back 30 years ago, you took out a student loan and it was structured much like a mortgage. Like, you borrow $10,000, you're going to repay $250 a month for the next 10 years. That's not a great formula for students who are just starting out their career, right? Like, early career, it might take you a while to find a job. The first job you find might not be a great fit. So there might be some times where you can't actually afford the $250, even though if we think about your lifetime trajectory of income, you can afford the loan. So what we've done in the past couple of decades is we've created a bunch of what we call income-driven repayment programs. And essentially what these programs do is they move away from that mortgage type system where it's, okay, you have to pay $250 a month, where now it says, okay, you have to pay 10% of your income a month towards your student loan. And so if you're unemployed, your income's zero and you owe zero on your student loan. And so what that does is it makes the payment variable, and it also makes the length of time that you're repaying variable. So instead of just repaying your loan for 10 years, you're now repaying it basically until you've made all the payments. And so these programs are already up and running. About a third of students are already enrolled in these. And so there's really not a student loan repayment problem for any student in these programs. And so to me, the easiest solution to the student loan crisis is basically make these programs the default student loan repayment program. Because right now the default program is the mortgage type. But if we made one of these income-driven repayment programs the default program, we basically have solved the debt repayment crisis.
Another case where sometimes people make an argument, and I think a reasonably strong argument, that maybe loans could be forgiven is in the admittedly pretty rare cases where the institution, the school that the person is going to, was falsifying some of their records. They're supposed to, all the schools that participate are supposed to be reporting information to the government, and occasionally some schools falsify that information, and they're supposed to be showing do your graduates get jobs, and some basic things about that, and so when there's been falsification, I mean, I think there's a fairly strong case to be able to say, well, that was fraud. But we already have programs in place, and loans get forgiven when institutions engage in this misconduct, right?
Yeah, that's true. And so if your institution closes, or if it's kind of proven in a court of law to have engaged in fraudulent activity, you can get your debt wiped out. It's not a straightforward or easy process. And so, for example, I don't know if you followed the news, but Columbia University just sort of got caught cheating on the U.S. News and World Report rankings. So in theory, students who had enrolled could say, hey, I enrolled based on US News and World Report saying you're a top school, but you lied. Like, we should actually see those types of cases. We tend not to. So what we actually tend to see is once a school closes or once it declares bankruptcy. So those are generally for-profit schools, like a for-profit school will go bankrupt or something like that. At that point, there's nobody to defend if you accuse them of fraud, right? Because the school's gone. And so the students basically get kind of like almost like a summary judgment. And that's what we've been seeing a lot in the news lately with it's called borrower defense to repayment. So we've seen a lot, like billions of dollars in student loans that are forgiven for these schools that have closed down because you can basically accuse them of fraud and nobody's around to say, no, actually, like we were a legit school at the time. Now, some of them probably were fraudulent, but right now it's kind of a free for all for any school that's closed.
No, some people, and you mentioned this as one of the categories of arguments. Some people have argued that student loan forgiveness could have an economic stimulus effect. Now, certainly at this point in time, 2022, if anything, our economy is overheated. So at that point, some of that argument at this point in time is pretty irrelevant. But talk a little bit about the potential for economic stimulus from this, because at one level, although people might look and say like, oh, somebody's got $50,000 in loans, if you do forgive those loans, it's not going to have as much of a stimulus impact, especially in the next year or so, as you might guess from saying like, oh, they got $50,000 in loans forgiven. So explain that a little bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of one of the favorite arguments for economists who support loan forgiveness is that, hey, this would stimulate the economy. I really don't think there's much truth to that. I don't think it would provide much, if any, stimulus. And like you said, right now we're in a very inflationary environment. So to the extent that this does provide stimulus, it would basically just increase inflation. And so the kind of the big picture problems with the argument that forgiveness would provide stimulus is that you need to finance it somehow, right? So either you're going to raise taxes on somebody else, which means that they now have less money to spend. So like if you give if you give me $10, but we take it from you, I spend $10 more, you spend $10 less. The economy's not any better off. So if we're tax financing it, it's just a wash. If we deficit finance, so if the government just borrows, well, where's it borrowing that money from? Well, it's borrowing that money from somebody who would have financed either, a new car or a new house or a business that would have built a new factory. So it's taking those resources. It's basically bidding those resources away by bidding up high interest rates. And so you get kind of offsetting effects there. The only time that you could convince me that forgiveness would be stimulus is if we're in a pretty deep recession where we've got a lot of unemployed people and a lot of unemployed resources around. Because at that point, you can at least plausibly make the argument that there's some sort of positive feedback loop here where, okay, some people are unemployed. We give this we borrow, the government borrows money, it gives it to this set of group of people, they start spending it. That's going to draw some of those unemployed people who then spend. That's at least plausible. Like it's by no means proven as like a consensus among economists, but it is like at least a coherent theory for how you could get a kind of a positive feedback loop with stimulus. But like we said, right now we're not in a recession. We've got terrible inflation, like the worst inflation we've had in my lifetime. And so any stimulus that loan forgiveness would provide would basically just show up as more inflation, and the Fed would have to move to contractionary monetary policy even more than it is right now to offset that inflationary impact. So to me, there's really no economic reason to push for this.
And even if you're thinking about government borrowing or anything, a number of left-leaning or liberal economists have pointed out that, when you're talking about $100 billion or maybe $500 billion in loan forgiveness, that's money that the federal government could actually spend on other programs. And again, if you wanted to help the low-income families in America, many people have pointed out that there are probably a dozen different ways, even if you want to think of this as federal spending, to forgive the loans, that there are other things we could do with the money that they think would be better options, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to the regressive nature. Like, if we want to transfer money from the haves to the have-nots, you don't do it through student loan forgiveness. That's just a silly way to do that. We can easily identify the people. We could double the earned income tax credit. We could do all sorts of things that would actually target these resources to folks who have a much greater claim to needing the money than doctors, lawyers, and dentists who have a lot of student loan debt.
We could even double or triple the size of the Pell Grant program, which would particularly help low income students trying to go to college, because then Pell Grants they don't have to repay. So there's a lot of other things that another I guess economists always talk about opportunity costs, and so there's a good point to bring that in and say whenever we spend money on something.
So one of the quotes in the paper talks about how if we did all student loan forgiveness, so all 1.6 trillion, that would actually be more than we've spent on welfare programs since 1980. And it was like, that just blows your mind, where you're like, I've got my issues with the welfare programs, but at least they're trying to target the money to people who don't have it, right? Whereas student loan forgiveness just doesn't do that at all, and it would spend even more money than that. Like, it's just crazy.
And again, as you mentioned, there are things that could be done to target loan forgiveness. You could make it means tested or based on people's incomes, and then just forgive the loans for the lowest income earners. But moving beyond that, a number of people, one of the biggest factors in college policy college economics over the last 40 years has been the great increase in the real cost of college, even controlling for inflation. College is a lot more expensive now than it was 40 years ago. How would student loan forgiveness impact that cost, and would it have any chance of doing anything to control rising costs in the future?
So I think this is actually one of the most damaging impacts of student loan forgiveness, is that if you do it once, it raises the expectation that it's going to happen again and again and again. And so how does that change people's and colleges' behavior? Well, if you think about students and families, all of a sudden, nobody's working to pay their way through school anymore. Nobody's spending 2 years at a community college to save money and then transferring to a four-year college. Everybody's going to the most expensive school they can get into, borrowing as much as possible. And so we basically kind of increase the amount of demand for student loans. At the same time, how do colleges respond to that? Well, if the colleges are convinced that the students don't need to repay the debt, there's no harm in raising their prices, right? So colleges are going to raise their prices as well. And so we're basically going to find ourselves in this exact same situation in a couple of years, where we forgive $1.6 trillion of debt today. Within a couple of years, we're going to have $2 trillion of debt, because everybody's borrowing as much as possible. College is even more expensive because everybody's convinced that the government's just going to do another round of forgiveness.
Yeah, and I think reasonable loan forgiveness would take us a good part of the way toward free college. Well, this has been really fascinating. Again, getting into some of these issues about possibly forgiving the loans. And so I want to thank you for coming on our show. And I want to thank you, the viewers, for tuning in. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.